The crystal chandelier cast long shadows over the dining room as my father stood at the head of the table. He had perfect posture, a habit from his military days. The old grandfather clock in the corner struck 7. "As you all know," he began, his voice firm, "Ashworth Manor has been in our family for 5 generations. Now it's time to secure its future." I sat quietly, running my fingers over the wooden table where I'd spent so many family dinners. My brother James leaned back in our grandfather's chair, a smug smile on his face. He already knew what was coming. "James will take over the estate," Dad announced. "He'll manage everything, the house, the land, the investments. It's time for the next generation to lead." My mother nodded. "It's the natural order of things," she said. I thought of Great Aunt Martha. 3 months ago, she had pressed a small brass key into my hand. "The blue room," she had whispered. "When the time comes, remember the blue room." Dad's voice pulled me back to the present. "And Olivia, you'll get the guest cottage. It's a generous offer, considering you chose marine biology instead of learning estate management." James smirked. "Don't worry, sis. You can still visit the main house when I'm not entertaining." The cottage. A pretty way to keep me close, but without power. I thought of the women who had built this estate, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and Great-Aunt Martha. They had shaped Ashworth Manor in ways no one seemed to remember. "I see," I said calmly. My father hesitated, surprised by my reaction. "Well, that's settled," he said, reaching for the transfer papers. "We'll sign everything tomorrow." That night, I went to the east wing. The blue room had been Great-Aunt Martha's private study. The brass key felt warm in my hand as I unlocked the door. The room smelled of old books and history. Moonlight streamed in, shining on her desk. I traced my fingers over the bookshelves, remembering her words. "This estate wasn't built by men alone, Olivia. The women of Ashworth Manor have always been its true guardians." Behind her portrait, just as she had said, I found the wall safe. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a thick envelope sealed with the family crest. James had always seen the estate as a symbol of status. He never cared about its history. He laughed at my interest in the gardens and archives. "Playing house won't make you the heir," he had teased. But Great-Aunt Martha had seen things differently. She had spent years preparing me for this moment. As I read through the documents, a smile formed on my lips. Tomorrow my father would learn the truth. Great-Aunt Martha had created a trust 30 years ago. No major decision about the estate could be made without approval from both a male and female heir. My phone buzzed. A message from James. "Don't be difficult tomorrow. The cottage really is the best option for you." I placed the papers back in the safe and locked it. Tomorrow would change everything. Before heading back, I stopped at the family graveyard and laid fresh roses on Great-Aunt Martha's grave. "Thank you," I whispered. "I'll protect what you built." As I walked back to the manor, its lights glowing warmly in the night, I knew one thing for sure. Ashworth Manor's future wasn't my father's alone to decide, and I was ready to fight for my place in its legacy. The next morning's meeting in the estate's mahogany-paneled library felt like a carefully orchestrated play. Father's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, arranged his papers meticulously while James paced by the window, occasionally checking his reflection in the glass. "Let's make this quick," James said, checking his watch. "I have plans to meet the developers about modernizing the East Wing." I sat in Great-Aunt Martha's favorite armchair, the trust documents tucked safely in my bag. My mother perched on the edge of her seat, anxiously smoothing her skirt. "Now then," Mr. Peterson began, "the transfer documents are straightforward. Mr. Ashworth will retain life rights to the cottage on the grounds, while the main estate transfers to James, effective immediately." "Actually," I interrupted softly, "there's something you should see first." I withdrew the envelope, watching my father's expression shift from annoyance to curiosity. "What's this?" he demanded as I handed the documents to Mr. Peterson. "Great-Aunt Martha's trust agreement," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Created in 1993 and registered with the family's long-standing law firm in London." Mr. Peterson's eyes widened as he read through the papers. This changes everything," he muttered. "What do you mean?" James snapped, striding over to peer at the documents. "The estate was placed in an irrevocable trust 30 years ago," Mr. Peterson explained, his professional demeanor slipping slightly. "According to these terms, any major decisions regarding Ashworth Manor require joint approval from both male and female heirs." The color drained from my father's face. That's impossible. Martha would have told me. Would you have listened? I asked quietly. You barely paid attention when she tried to discuss estate management with you. James snatched the papers from Mr. Peterson. This can't be legally binding, he sputtered. It's ridiculous. I've seen these documents before, Mr. Peterson admitted. They're quite real and quite binding. Martha Ashworth was thorough in her legal preparations. My mother finally found her voice. But what about tradition? The estate has always passed to the eldest son. That tradition, I said, was actually broken several times. Great-grandmother Elizabeth ran the estate during the war. Grandmother Rose managed all financial decisions in the 1960s. Great-aunt Martha doubled our holdings in the last 30 years. The women of this family have always been more than decorative figureheads. James threw the papers onto the desk. This is just like you, isn't it? Always having to prove something. You couldn't just be happy with the cottage. The cottage was never the point, James. This isn't about where I live. It's about preserving what generations of our family built. Something you'd understand if you'd ever bothered to learn our real history. Father slumped in his chair, looking suddenly older. Martha knew. All this time she knew this would happen. She knew you tried to exclude me, I corrected gently. Just like she was excluded until she fought her way into management. She wanted to ensure that pattern wouldn't continue. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. Given these circumstances, I suggest we adjourn to review the full implications of the trusts. Any transfer documents signed today would be invalid. James stormed out, slamming the library door hard enough to rattle the family portraits on the walls. Mother followed, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. My father remained staring at me with a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. You're more like Martha than I realize, he said finally. I'll take that as a compliment, I replied, gathering my things. When you're ready to discuss actual estate management, including preservation of the historical wings rather than modern development, I'll be in Great-aunt Martha's study. There's quite a lot in her records that we should review. As I walked through the manor's familiar halls, I felt the presence of all the strong women who'd come before me. They each faced their own battles to protect and improve this place. Now it was my turn. In the blue room, I opened the curtains wide, letting sunlight flood the space. On Martha's desk, next to her favorite fountain pen, I placed a framed photo. 4 generations of Ashworth women standing proud in front of the manor. Soon, there would be decisions to make, challenges to face. But for now, I simply sat in my great-aunt's chair, knowing I was exactly where I belonged. The estate would have its female guardian once again. 3 months after the trust revelation, Ashworth Manor hummed with a different kind of energy. The autumn leaves painted the grounds in rich golds and crimsons as I walked the perimeter with our heritage consultant, discussing restoration plans for the Victorian greenhouse. James had finally started attending management meetings, though his initial resistance had been fierce. His developer friend's grand modernization plans had been firmly shelved, replaced by historically sensitive renovations that would actually preserve the estate's value. The original blueprints your great-aunt preserved are invaluable, the consultant remarked, examining the greenhouse's intricate ironwork. We can restore this exactly as your great-grandmother designed it. I smiled, remembering Martha's meticulous records. She preserved everything, knowing someday it would matter. Later that afternoon, I found my father in the library, reviewing the estate's quarterly accounts. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening slightly. The trust fund investments Martha made are performing better than expected, he said, gesturing to the papers. She really did know what she was doing. She tried to tell you that for years, I replied, sitting across from him. All of them did. He nodded slowly. I've been reading through the old records, the decisions your grandmother made during the market crash of '73. They saved this place. I never knew. Because you never asked, I said gently. We were always more than just daughters and sisters. We were stewards. A knock at the door interrupted us. James entered, looking uncomfortable but determined. The Historical Society called, he said. They want to feature the manor in their Heritage Homes publication. Apparently, they're particularly interested in the women's history here. Great-aunt Martha would have loved that, I said, watching my brother's face. Listen, he sighed. I've been thinking. Maybe we could restore the East Wing Conservatory instead of building that modern extension. The original plans you found, they make more sense. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd get, and I accepted it with a nod. I'd like that. We could make it a showcase piece for the Historical Society. Mother found us all still in the library as evening approached. She hesitated in the doorway, then straightened her shoulders. I've been going through Martha's papers too, she admitted. I never realized, all these years I thought tradition meant keeping things the same. But our family's real tradition was adaptation. Progress. The women of this house, they built while they preserved. I thought of Martha's last words to me, the papers will protect you, but your strength will save this place. The manor's future was securing itself in ways I hadn't expected. James was learning to value preservation over profit. Father was discovering the rich history he'd overlooked. Even Mother was beginning to see beyond the rigid roles she'd accepted without question. That night, I sat in the blue room, adding my own notes to Martha's meticulous records. The trust had given me legal standing, but the real work was in proving myself a worthy guardian of this legacy. A photo on my desk caught my eye, taken just last week. It showed 4 generations of Ashworth women, but this time it included a new face. James's daughter Emma, born 2 months after the trust revelation. She sat perched on my lap, her curious eyes already taking in the grand house that would someday be part of her heritage too. I wrote her name carefully in the family record, just as Martha had recorded mine years ago. The future of Ashworth Manor would need all its children, sons and daughters alike, to understand and protect its legacy. Outside my window, the manor's lights glowed warmly against the darkening sky. The same lights that had guided generations of Ashworth's home, now illuminating a path forward that honored both tradition and progress. Great Aunt Martha's trust had done more than protect my rights. It had forced us all to confront our prejudices, to recognize the strength that comes from embracing all of our family's capabilities. The true legacy of Ashworth Manor wasn't in its ancient stones or sprawling grounds, but in the wisdom of those who'd understood that preservation requires both change and constancy. I closed the ledger, smiling at the portrait of Martha that washed over the blue room. "We're all right," I whispered. "The manor is in good hands," and somewhere I knew my great aunt was smiling too.